Hello once again everyone, and welcome back to Moveset Breakdowns. Apologies for the delay in this series, I had a lot going on, but now we're back at it, and today we're going to be covering the man, the myth, the legend, the Centurion. So, when it comes to the Centurion's moveset, he doesn't necessarily have a ton of complicated moves. He has some decently complicated hand switches, but the actual pieces that make up his moveset are not all that difficult to see or perceive or even really talk about. I will go through them, but the Centurion in particular is a very good example of someone who very much expresses character through choreography. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about that today. Now, when it comes to Centurion, his weapon is going to be, of course, the gladius. I have a Xiphos trainer from Purple Heart I picked up a few years ago that'll serve my purposes. Though, as a note, I will say for a lot of like his hand switches and stuff, having handled gladiuses, their weight does lend to that movement pretty easily. It's got a surprising amount of weight right here, and its point of balance is relatively tight. But when it comes to Centurion's basic fighting, I think my buddy Dake from Celtic Curse Gaming, and if you'd like to see me and him play some Hellish Court or other things, check out the channel. I'll put a link to it in the description. But Dake's theory, when we were talking about it, was that he believes the choreography for the Centurion is actually based off of a movie called Dragon Blade. Now, if you've not heard of it, it is a movie with John Cusack and Jackie Chan that is set way, way back in the day when Romans make contact with China. And there's a lot of really interesting choreography, and the Romans in particular make a lot of use of fighting with the gladius without the scutum. So they use it both in sword grip, they switch hands, ambidexterity is even drawn as like a major attention point for the way the Romans fight. Use of elbow strikes, use of punches. There's a lot of that in the choreography, and I very much think that it had an influence on the way the Centurion fights. You should look up the fight scenes on YouTube and tell me that doesn't look familiar. But either way, when it comes to Centurion, what I would say is that very much based upon his stance, he is someone that used to fight with a scutum, but is now not. And that is the biggest thing, is that I think the Centurion's role within the For Honor universe has altered. So him not having a scutum doesn't really affect things as much from my perspective. It's more of, this is the sword he always fought with. Now he's fulfilling a different battlefield role, so he's tossed aside the scutum. As it'd be a little strange for him to be running around and fighting as an individual with a formation weapon. Not that you couldn't still make it work, but I don't necessarily have a problem with that per se. Especially given the amount of armor that he's wearing. As it'd be a little, so now that we've got the minions who do the minion job, because minions exist, you don't really need a Centurion there. But either way, I digress. When it comes to his positioning and his general stances, we're going to have pretty basic ones. You're going to be left foot forward with your gauntlets at hand just held down here, and your sword held in essentially a low fluke. Now, if you move into the high guard, he's just going to raise it up behind him a bit like Lugislan and be ready for the cut. If you switch sides, however, he will also switch hands. So, low on my left, high on my left, high on my right, low on my right. Now the ambidexterity thing, I think the main reason they went for it is because they didn't want him standing here, which from the third person perspective, you wouldn't really be able to see the sword very clearly, so you might not necessarily know where you were. But I think it would have been a little cooler for him to go into reverse grip on this side, as this is a dagger guard, and he does use this a lot like a big knife, so I think that would have been a kind of cool thing to do. But oh well, him standing and switching his hands doesn't really affect things that much, as even though he does hand switch quite a bit, he's still predominantly right-handed. It's really only occasionally that he switches hands. But we'll get into that more in a moment. So, when it comes to his basic attacks, we're going to see whenever you throw a light, it'll be a cut, and when you do a heavy, it will be a thrust. So let's talk about his lights. Now I really like the Centurion's lights, as they're very good cuts. He's going to be using a simple, advanced sort of footwork that the Warlord used, wherein if I were to throw a light from my right, that's all it's going to be. Nothing too complicated. If I were to throw two lights together, he will actually cut with the same arm. So 1, 2, before he's back in guard. Here's that again. 1, 2, back in guard. However, if you switch sides, same thing applies. 1, 1, 1, 2. Just to switch sides. If he chooses to cut from above, it's going to be usually, for example, 1, 2. So he's going to bring it around the head and down. Alternatively, if I'm here, just basically straight down, very hammer-like strike. So his cuts aren't anything too complicated. Let's go ahead and talk about his area attack while we're there. So his area attack, regardless of which hand it's in at the time, if you do your zone attack, it'll be just left, right, left into guard. Here's that from the side. So we're here, left, right, left. And he opens himself up a bit more. He's usually a bit more boom, 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 where he's kind of opening the chest and using a little bit of momentum because he kind of hangs on the outside. But even if you have it in the left-handed, before he starts, he will switch before he cuts. But where it gets more interesting is when we start looking at his heavies, which are his thrusts. Now his heavies have a couple different versions. So there's just the straight up heavy, and then there's a charged heavy, and it does change. So let's look at those. For striking from below, it's going to be just a nice little standard extension, just boom, right? Boom. Other side, boom. Nothing too complicated there. For above, it's going to be kind of this over the scutum sort of stab, boom, boom. Same thing on the other side. Nothing too complicated there. If you charge those heavies, he's going to do a bit more of a Superman. So what that means is he's going to pull back, sink his body down, and then throw his body into it. And when he sticks this, he will also rip it back out because he put a bit more of his momentum, so he got a bit more of a stab. So here's on the other side. Clear. Or here's it from above. And then out. So nothing too crazy there. Now, if you do two heavies in a row, or do a light into a heavy, then he's going to do some interesting handwork. So, let's show a light into a heavy. So, we're going to cut down from our left side. Boom. He's then, sorry, by the way, we cut down from our left side with this before. Boom. He's going to reverse the hand, and then stab with his lead hand, reinforcing. So here's that on the other side. Cut, reverse, stab. The same thing will be done if he does two thrusts in a row. So 1, 2. And that one's a little easier to do because all you do is you extend, and as you retract, you put your other hand on top, and then you push it through again. When it comes to doing that on the top though, that's when he does a very impressive hand switch. So he will go from the sword grip to the ice pick grip. It's not necessarily impossible to do, it's just very difficult. So here's that again. 1, 2, and clear. Now, those are pretty much all of his basic movements. The only things that we're going to see now is when he adds to them. So for example, sometimes when you charge up the heavy and get a bit of additive to it, he'll do a hop, skip, and a jump into his thrust. Of course, when you knock someone down, he will use what we call the Roman Air Force, which is where he will jump into the thrust. An interesting detail, when he lands that, if it kills the person, he will reinforce it a little bit, kind of add an extra stab before clearing, which is kind of cool to see. But otherwise, it's going to be basically the same idea over and over and over again. So let's go ahead and move on to his blocks and his parries. So when it comes to his blocks, the Centurion is unique in that he doesn't just put the sword between him and the incoming attack. He actually cuts back at these incoming attacks. So here comes an attack, he's going to see it off. Cut comes in, he sees it off. Cut comes in, he sees it off. He's just kind of expelling it out to the side, which is a nice detail since he doesn't have a ton of weapon to defend himself with. Now when it comes to actually doing a parry, he's going to lay the gladius on the outside of his arm, and he's going to reinforce to catch it. This is very Tonfa-like parry from what I understand, but here's that again. So attack comes in, moves up to defend himself, and as you see I'm not particularly good at it. There we go, lock it in place. Attack comes in this side, boom. Attack comes this side, boom. And from there, he launches into a pretty cool combo, which is why I really like the fact that he blocks like this. So he'll catch, grab, knee, and then he's into the rest of his actions, which is quite cool to see. And he really does just drive that knee up. I'm not particularly good at throwing knees, but he certainly is. Now, when it comes to use of his hand as a punching implement, he's going to throw 3 distinctive strikes. So, he will throw either an uppercut or kind of this big charge sort of cross. So what that'll look like is, usually it's going to be after landing a heavy. So, heavy, boom, and we're good, or heavy, boom. And it seems to be random whether or not he throws up or out, but either way, it gets the point across. He will also, when he guard breaks, give a hard smack if he's throwing to his right, or if he's throwing to his left and pommels on that side, he'll bump them with the back. But all these pieces to show that really the Centurion's just making the most out of the fact that he has an empty hand. In fact, I'd say in regards to how heroes use their offhand, he probably uses his the most, which is impressive considering he doesn't have a weapon there. But this is even more apparent in his executions, which are, I've chosen a couple for us. So the first execution we're going to go off of is actually one of my favorites for doing against Lawbringers. And the reason I really like it is because against the original Lawbringer skin, they didn't have cuisses on, so this was just, trousers basically. Wherein we've landed with our heavy, we're going to clear out, reverse grip, slash, slash, switch, stab, push. So here's that one more time. We're through, pull back, switch, 1, 2, stab, push. The reason I like that is it just shows a little bit of creativity in the way that he's setting up his final, which is pretty much always going to be either a really hard cut or a thrust, and he does favor the thrust. Now the next one I've chosen is one that goes a little bit further, and again shows him being creative in the way he uses both of his arms. So in this one, you'll land, you'll clear, and the opponent is actually going to try and tackle. He will pommel in the middle of the back to try and upset. He will pommel in the middle of the back, switch, and attempt to stab. They will block this. They'll wrestle for a moment. He'll switch hands, going into the ice pick grip, strike them with the pommel, stab them in the foot, clear to bring it up, switch hands, and then step back with an almighty uppercut. So here's that again. We just landed, clear, tackle, smack, attempted stab, transfer over, stab, pommel, stab, cuts, wham! Like I said, it's a particularly fun one because it shows a lot of different use of his weapon, which is interesting, and I really like doing that one on Viking characters because, especially the shaman, because it shows they're trying to fight back. This is awesome. But anyway, and the final execution is, again, another movie reference, because you can't not have movie references with the Centurion, and it's going to be the Achilles-esque stab. So what that'll be is he's just landed, he'll clear and push, yo! And then he'll just walk off. Now this, of course, is a reference to Brad Pitt in Troy, which, if you don't know the story behind why he does that particular move, the character that he's fighting is blind in his left eye. So what Achilles is doing is he's moving to his blind side and then leaping onto his blind side, which means that he can't see him. So Achilles is a little bit smarter than people give him credit for. But either way, here's that one more time. Land, clear, step back, and then just walk off. So what do we think about the Centurion based upon his moveset? Well, I think for certain, he was a very well-trained soldier, probably fought with a scutum for many, many years, and now that he's fulfilling a different battlefield role, he's taken his old familiar weapon and is using it much more personally. Because if there's one thing that I guarantee that soldiers or fighters or something along those lines are going to do, is that over time, they're going to develop little tricks with their weapon just by nature of playing around with it. And to me, if there was one word to really describe the Centurion, it would be callous. He is remarkably practical in the way that he just shuts people down, but he also has a flair for the dramatic. We see him, of course, be relatively taunting in a lot of his actions. A lot of his lines are just outright, praising himself, so maybe he's a bit narcissistic. Though we also have instances where he mimics the gladiators, which would be something he would, of course, grow up watching. Basically, he wants to be a superstar, would be how I would describe it. And so he's adding that dramatic flair because to him, these people are no challenge. He knows exactly what skills he has, and he can just back it up over and over and over again. And as anybody who's played against him knows, yeah, when he starts juggling you, that's it. One more thing, of course, would be his big kick, but that doesn't really require a whole breakdown. But either way, the Centurion, a very well-trained soldier who has gotten bored and is now ripping apart people around him as though they're nothing. But either way, that's going to be our moveset breakdown. I hope you guys have enjoyed. I really liked doing this moveset because he's one of my favorite characters. And I'm probably Probably going to tackle one or two more For Honor characters and then take a break again. But either way, thank you very much for watching, and we'll go over some other movesets another time.